We are going to build one complete C# feature, not just type an endpoint and hope the rest appears later. The result is small: send a title to an ASP.NET Core API, validate it, create a work item, store it, and prove the response through a real HTTP test. When the request is valid, the API returns 201 created with a server-generated identifier. When the title is empty or too long, it returns a useful validation response. That is already a vertical slice because one observable user outcome crosses every layer it needs. Beginners are often shown controllers, services, repositories, and entities as separate topics. That makes a code base feel like a collection of folders. A feature is easier to understand as a path. Data enters through a contract. Business rules decide whether the request is valid. A storage boundary preserves the accepted state. The transport maps success or failure into an HTTP response. A test drives the same path a client will use. We will keep each part deliberately small, but we will not leave any part imaginary. The feature is only complete when the path works from the outside. Start with the request contract. The caller may choose the title, so the request contains one string. It does not contain an identifier, creation time, completed flag, or future owner identifier. Those values belong to trusted server behavior. The response is a different contract because the server can now return the identifier, normalized title, status, and creation time. Separate request and response types make trust visible. If we reused the entity as an input model, a caller could eventually send fields that should never be under client control. The smallest contract is usually the safest contract and the easiest one to explain. The model should make invalid state difficult to create. A static create method trims the title, checks the useful length, and only then constructs the object. Notice that the constructor is not the public entry point. That gives the rule one home instead of repeating it in every endpoint or user interface. We also inject a time provider rather than calling datetime now inside the rule. The first endpoint uses the system clock, while a focused unit test can provide a fixed clock later. The identifier and time are generated after validation, so rejected requests do not pretend that a real work item existed. Episode 1 uses an in-memory store so we can see the feature shape without database setup hiding the lesson. The interface exposes only the capabilities this slice needs: add an accepted item and list current items. The implementation uses a concurrent dictionary because a singleton web service can handle several requests at once. This is not our final persistent strategy, and we should say that plainly. The boundary is useful because Episode 2 can replace the implementation with Entity Framework Core while the HTTP contract and business rule remain recognizable. An abstraction earns its keep when a real change crosses it, not because every class deserves an interface. Now the endpoint coordinates the slice. It accepts the request contract and the store through dependency injection. It asks the model to create valid state, persists the result, and maps that result to 201 created. A rejected title becomes a validation problem rather than an unhandled 500 error. The endpoint is orchestration, not the owner of the title rule. That distinction matters as the application grows. A Blazor form, a mobile client, and an import job can all reach the same rule through their own transport. Keep the endpoint readable enough that a reviewer can see the complete success and failure path without scrolling through unrelated helpers. A tempting shortcut is to bind the request directly to the entity. It looks convenient because the framework fills every property for us. It also quietly changes the trust boundary. A caller can forge creation times, choose identifiers that collide, mark new work as completed, or later claim another owner's data. Overposting is not only a large enterprise security concern, it starts with beginner examples that teach the wrong shape. Use small request contracts and create trusted values on the server. In Episode 3 we will add authentication, and the owner identifier will come from the authenticated name identifier claim, never from JSON. The proof starts the actual web application with Web Application Factory and sends JSON over an HTTP client. This is more valuable than calling the endpoint delegate directly because routing, model binding, serialization, dependency injection, and status mapping all participate. The test deliberately sends white space around the title and asserts the normalized response. A second test sends an empty title and expects bad request. A third creates an item and confirms the list endpoint can see it. 3 small tests describe the public behavior of the slice. If we later change storage, these tests should continue to describe the same feature contract. Run .NET test from the companion solution. The web project builds, the test host starts, and all 3 integration tests pass. This checkpoint is intentionally modest. Restarting the process loses the work items, and that is exactly the next problem we will solve. The important part is that we now have a stable outside contract before persistence arrives. When Entity Framework changes the implementation, a regression in validation or HTTP behavior will be visible immediately. Small green checkpoints make a course easier to follow and a production code base easier to change. A complete beginner feature does not need many projects or a complicated architecture. It needs a clear input contract, one home for the rule, a storage capability, deliberate transport results, and executable proof. That is enough structure to grow without pretending we already know every future requirement. In Episode 2 we will replace the in-memory store with Entity Framework Core, create a reviewed migration, and meet 2 provider gotchas that a fake database test would completely miss. The code for this exact checkpoint is tagged in the companion repository so you can run it before moving on.